Today we're going to start our third AP Biology video in the biochemistry unit. It's about our first macromolecule that we're covering, which is carbohydrates. Okay? So carbohydrates. So some quick functions here. Carbohydrates are primarily known for their quick energy source. So you've obviously heard of glucose, which is basically a simple sugar that your body uses and digests for quick energy. Glucagon is a stored reserve of that sugar, and later on in the course we'll actually be talking about glucagon and insulin, and that's a very important feedback mechanism, feedback loop and mechanism that the body uses to regulate blood sugar. So we'll take a look at that later on in the course. As for the second function, we have structure. So in certain organisms, carbohydrates are actually used to build structures. For example, in these beetles, and actually it's pretty common in other types of beetles too, you've got an exoskeleton that protects the organs, the internal organs of the beetle, and it is made of this carbohydrate called chitin. Okay? Another structure similar to that is cellulose, which makes the cell wall of plant cells. And obviously, that makes the cells rigid and it gives them structure. And it's actually one of the main differences between a plant cell and an animal cell. We'll see that in Unit 2 as well. Now, carbohydrates are made of simple monomers. Monomers, you see the prefix mono, which means one, and a monomer basically means it's one building block of a carbohydrate. So there's a couple names that the carbohydrate monomers go by. You've got monosaccharide, simple sugars, or starch. Notice that all three are pretty important because you might see one of these three, one being tested. So make sure that you know that those are pretty much the same. Now polymers, you see the prefix poly, which obviously means more than one. There is a greater distinction when it comes to carbohydrates, though. There are actually three different types of polymers. There's something called a disaccharide. Di is a prefix meaning two, so we can assume that a disaccharide is created using two sugars, two simple sugars, two starches, or two monosaccharides. An oligosaccharide is a less known term, and you may not need to know this for your AP biology class, but I did want to include it because that is usually made of 3 to 20 monosaccharides. Okay, so that's the size for what we call an oligosaccharide. Less common of a term. You may not need to know it again, but I just wanted to include it. A polysaccharide, meaning poly, is usually 20 or more monosaccharides. And oftentimes many people will just ignore the oligosaccharides and call anything 3 monosaccharides or above a polysaccharide. Now the bond type, this is very important, and we'll see this on the next slide as well, but the bond type that goes in between two monosaccharides is called the glycosidic linkage, and we'll definitely point that out in the next slide. And then one more thing to know about carbohydrates that's pretty important is that they have a carbon-hydrogen-oxygen ratio of 1 to 2 to 1. So the amount of hydrogens in a carbohydrate is twice the amount of carbon atoms and oxygen atoms. And we'll also see that in the next slide. So now we're trying to identify the chemical structure of a carbohydrate. So you will see it in two different ways. You will see these carbon rings often presented to you, or you might see individual monosaccharides presented in this format here, which is just, it has a carbon backbone here with hydrogens and hydroxyl groups. This OH is a hydroxyl group, so those are stemming off as well. And so when you see these carbon rings, each corner of this hexagon, this created hexagon, has a carbon in it. Okay, so you could count carbon, here's a 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 carbon, and so on. And you'll see that although it's not written on the diagram, it's pretty much assumed in all of these ring structures that in between each of these vertices that you call them, that there are carbons in between there. The glycosidic linkages link together different monomers. Not different monomers, they're the same monomers, but they link them together. And so this right here is a monosaccharide or a monomer of carbohydrates. It's a simple glucose, simple sugar. This is another one, and this is another one. And notice how there's an extension of that with N. So N basically meaning that you could keep going on and on with the amount of carbon rings that you choose to add on and the amount of monosaccharides that you choose to add on. So right now, this entire compound would be called, based on the previous distinction here, they'd either be called an oligosaccharide or a polysaccharide. You can't call them a disaccharide because they contain they contain more than two sugars, more than two monomers. Now, a quick note about the glycosidic linkages, and there will be a video specifically on this. There are processes that are designed and happen biologically that serve to either create a bigger polymer, so adding on more of these monomers to the ends, or there are ones that break up these glycosidic linkages and make a polymer turn into a monomer. And so there will be a specific video about that. The two processes are called hydrolysis and dehydration synthesis, but we'll get to those later on in the future. And I hope you enjoyed this video. It's a basic overview of what you should know about carbohydrates in the biochemistry unit. Have a nice day.